Mrs. Manstey's View by Edith Wharton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rena Toby. Mrs. Manstey's View by Edith Wharton. As first published in Scribner's Magazine, July 1891. The view from Mrs. Manstey's window was not a striking one, but to her at least it was full of interest and beauty. Mrs. Manstey occupied the back room on the third floor of a New York boarding house, in a street where the ash barrels lingered late on the sidewalks, and the gaps in the pavement would have staggered a Quintus Curtius. She was the widow of a clerk in a large wholesale house, and his death had left her alone, for her only daughter had married in California and could not afford the long journey to New York to see her mother. Mrs. Manstey perhaps might have joined her daughter in the West, but they had now been so many years apart that they had ceased to feel any need of each other's society, and their intercourse had long been limited to the exchange of a few perfunctory letters, written with indifference by the daughter, and with difficulty by Mrs. Manstey, whose right hand was growing stiff with gout. Even had she felt a stronger desire for her daughter's companionship, Mrs. Manstey's increasing infirmity, which caused her to dread the 3 flights of stairs between her room and the street, would have given her pause on the eve of undertaking so long a journey. And without perhaps formulating these reasons, she had long since accepted as a matter of course her solitary life in New York. She was indeed not quite lonely, for a few friends still toiled up now and then to her room, but their visits grew rare as the years went by. Mrs. Manstey had never been a sociable woman, and during her husband's lifetime his companionship had been all sufficient to her. For many years she had cherished a desire to live in the country, to have a hen house and a garden, but this longing had faded with age, leaving only in the breast of the uncommunicative old woman a vague tenderness for plants and animals. It was perhaps this tenderness which made her cling so fervently to her view from her window, a view in which the most optimistic eye would at first have failed to discover anything admirable. Mrs. Manstey, from her coign of vantage, a slightly projecting bow window where she nursed an ivy and a succession of unwholesome-looking bulbs, looked out first upon the yard of her own dwelling, of which, however, she could get but a restricted glimpse. Still her gaze took in the topmost boughs of the ailanthus below her window, and she knew how early each year the clump of disanthra strung its bending stalk with hearts of pink. But of greater interest were the yards beyond. Being for the most part attached to boarding-houses, they were in a state of chronic untidiness and fluttering, on certain days of the week with miscellaneous garments and frayed tablecloths. In spite of this, Mrs. Manstey found much to admire in the long vista which she commanded. Some of the yards were, indeed, but stony wastes, with grass in the cracks of the pavement, and no shade in spring save that afforded by the intermittent leafage of the clotheslines. These yards Mrs. Manstey disapproved of, but the others, the green ones, she loved. She had grown used to their disorder. The broken barrels, the empty bottles, and paths unswept no longer annoyed her. Hers was the happy faculty of dwelling on the pleasanter side of the prospect before her. In the very next enclosure did not a magnolia open its hard white flowers against the watery blue of April? And was there not, a little way down the line, a fence foamed over every May, be lilac waves of wisteria? Farther still, a horse-chestnut lifted its candelabra of buff and pink blossoms above broad fans of foliage, while in the opposite yard June was sweet with the breath of a neglected syringa, which persisted in growing in spite of the countless obstacles opposed to its welfare. But if nature occupied the front rank in Mrs. Manstey's view, there was much of a more personal character to interest her in the aspect of the houses and their inmates. She deeply disapproved of the mustard-colored curtains which had lately been hung in the doctor's window opposite. But she glowed with pleasure when the house farther down had its old bricks washed with a coat of paint. The occupants of the houses did not often show themselves at the back windows, but the servants were always in sight. Noisy slatterns, Mrs. Manstey pronounced the greater number. She knew their ways and hated them. But to the quiet cook in the newly painted house, whose mistress bullied her, and who secretly fed the stray cats at nightfall, Mrs. Manstey's warmest sympathies were given. On one occasion her feelings were racked by the neglect of a housemaid, who for 2 days forgot to feed the parrot committed to her care. On the third day Mrs. Manstey, in spite of her gouty hand, had just penned a letter beginning, "Madam, it is now 3 days since your parrot has been fed," when the forgetful maid appeared at the window with a cup of seed in her hand. But in Mrs. Manstey's more meditative moods it was the narrowing perspective of far-off yards which pleased her best. She loved at twilight, when the distant brownstone spires seemed melting in the fluid yellow of the west, to lose herself in vague memories of a trip to Europe, made years ago, and now reduced in her mind's eye to a pale phantasmagoria of indistinct steeples and dreamy skies. Perhaps at heart Mrs. Manstey was an artist. At all events she was sensible of many changes of color unnoticed by the average eye, and dear to her as the green of early spring was the black lattice of branches against a cold sulphur sky at the close of a snowy day. She enjoyed also the sunny thaws of March, when patches of earth showed through the snow like ink spots spreading on a sheet of white blotting paper, and better still the haze of boughs, leafless but swollen, which replaced the clear-cut tracery of winter. She even watched with a certain interest the trail of smoke from a far-off factory chimney, and missed a detail in the landscape when the factory was closed and the smoke disappeared. Mrs. Manstey, in the long hours which she spent at her window, was not idle. She read a little, and knitted numberless stockings. But the view surrounded and shaped her life as the sea does a lonely island. When her rare callers came, it was difficult for her to detach herself from the contemplation of the opposite window washing, or the scrutiny of certain green points in a neighboring flower bed which might or might not turn into hyacinths, while she feigned an interest in her visitor's anecdotes about some unknown grandchild. Mrs. Manstey's real friends were the denizens of the yards, the hyacinths, the magnolia, the green parrot, the maid who fed the cats, the doctor who studied late behind his mustard-colored curtains, and the confidant of her tenderer musings was the church spire floating in the sunset. One April day, as she sat in her usual place, with knitting cast aside and eyes fixed on the blue sky mottled with round clouds, a knock at the door announced the entrance of her landlady. Mrs. Manstey did not care for her landlady, but she submitted to her visits with ladylike resignation. To-day, however, it seemed harder than usual to turn from the blue sky and the blossoming magnolia to Mrs. Sampson's unsuggestive face, and Mrs. Manstey was conscious of a distinct effort as she did so. "The magnolia is out earlier than usual this year, Mrs. Sampson," she remarked, yielding to a rare impulse, for she seldom alluded to the absorbing interest of her life. In the first place, it was a topic not likely to appeal to her visitors, and besides, she lacked the power of expression and could not have given utterance to her feelings had she wished to. "The what, Mrs. Manstey?" inquired the landlady, glancing about the room as if to find there was an explanation of Mrs. Manstey's statement. "The magnolia in the next yard, in Mrs. Black's yard," Mrs. Manstey repeated. "Is it indeed? I didn't know there was a magnolia there," said Mrs. Sampson carelessly. Mrs. Manstey looked at her. She did not know that there was a magnolia in the next yard. "By the way," Mrs. Sampson continued, "speaking of Mrs. Black reminds me that the work on the extension is to begin next week." "The what?" It was Mrs. Manstey's turn to ask. "The extension," said Mrs. Sampson, nodding her head in the direction of the ignored